Should we let people with terminal illnesses decide when they want to end their own life? Well, that's the question that we're going to discuss today. I'm going to talk about MAID, which stands for Medical Assistance in Dying, or also just known as euthanasia in Europe. I will use both terms interchangeably during this video. Here in Canada, MAID has been accessible since 2015 after the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that prohibiting assistance in dying was constitutionally void. Nearly a decade later, public opinion remains positive. In 2024, in the province that I live in, Quebec, 90% said that they supported the decision, and even for advance requests, which are requests for MAID that are done in advance knowing that they won't be able to consent in the future, 83% of people across Canada said that they were in favor for those with, quote, capacity eroding grievous and irremediable medical condition. So, public support for MAID is clear. People seem pretty happy with it. But should they be? To find out, I decided to dig into the topic. Over the past 2 months, I've read extensively about MAID, and after all that research, I've come to the conclusion that I am in favor of it. In this video, I'll start by presenting the strongest arguments against euthanasia, the best Steelman case I can make. Then I'll respond to each point and explain why I believe MAID should remain available. There will be timestamps put on this video, so feel free to jump around to the arguments that interest you the most. Also, if you disagree with anything that I say, make sure to join my Discord server in the description so that we can talk about it. So now let's cue the sad piano track. The reason why MAID should not be available to those at the end of their life is because human life is the most important thing we have. Allowing someone to end it due to pain, loneliness, or simply being tired of living undermines the value of all human lives by suggesting that life isn't sacred or worth enduring until its natural conclusion. With today's advanced technology, palliative care can ensure a comfortable and dignified end-of-life experience. Suffering can always be managed, and pain is no longer an insurmountable barrier. By normalizing MAID, we risk instilling fear about the end of life and potentially discouraging people from embracing an experience they may not fully understand. And choosing death is not like taking a Tylenol when you have a headache. It's a final, irreversible decision. Furthermore, MAID has a very high likelihood of going down a slippery slope, and this isn't just speculation. It's already happening in countries that have had MAID for years. In places like the Netherlands, the number of people accessing MAID rises every year, and the safeguards keep expanding. The definition of unbearable suffering in the Netherlands has been broadened repeatedly. In Canada now, MAID accounts for 1 in 20 deaths, and in Quebec it's even higher, it's 1 in 14. These numbers will just continue to climb. And also, the people getting euthanized are not just those with unsurmountable pain. In the Netherlands, nearly half, 49.1% of euthanasia recipients cite loneliness as part of their reasoning. Not only that, but in 1990, the Remlink report revealed that 50% of euthanasia cases at the time were non-voluntary. So, a slippery slope isn't a hypothetical concern, it's unfolding right now. Just take a look at this article. It explains how a 29-year-old woman with severe depression was able to end her life with the aid of the state. What's next? Are we just going to allow anyone to end their life in the future? If a breakup or a moment of despair becomes justification, are we prepared for the consequences of that trajectory? What's even more troubling is that in these countries, the trust between patients and doctors has been deeply undermined. Once physicians are permitted to end lives, how can you trust them to guide you through life's most challenging moments? How can you be certain they will protect you from yourself when you're at your most vulnerable? In the Netherlands, euthanasia has eroded trust in doctors so severely that some elderly individuals now carry anti-euthanasia cards. These cards are a desperate attempt to shield themselves from the very doctors who are supposed to care for them. It's a chilling reflection of how far things have gone. And finally, MAID opens the door for the state to prioritize cutting costs over saving lives, especially in countries with universal healthcare. What happens when keeping you alive becomes too expensive? To the system, after all, you're just a number, and there's a real risk that life-saving treatments could be denied in favor of pressuring you towards MAID as a cheaper alternative. This again isn't just speculation, it's already happening. In Canada, Alison Ducluso was diagnosed with terminal cancer and denied life-saving surgery because her prognosis was deemed too poor. Instead, she was offered MAID. And refusing to accept this, Ducluso sought surgery in Baltimore on her own and is now alive and well. Had she not fought back, she would not be here today. She would be dead. Even when faced with fear, pain, or loneliness, choosing an irreversible path like MAID is not the answer. Modern palliative care ensures that everyone can have a peaceful, pain-free end-of-life experience with dignity. This is not the Middle Ages anymore. Medicine has advanced to the point where suffering can be effectively managed. By banning MAID, we not only prevent dangerous slippery slopes, but also build a society that values and supports its most vulnerable members. A society that seeks solutions, not shortcuts, and ensures that no one feels discarded or pressured into ending their life. And scene. So this was my best attempt at still mending the case against euthanasia. Honestly, if I didn't already know much about the topic, these arguments might persuade me to view the procedure more critically. Now, let's break them down one by one, starting with the weakest arguments and working our way to the strongest. The weakest argument, in my opinion, is the claim that suffering can be good. In a paper titled "Why is it better to suffer and not to die through euthanasia?", the author argues that pain and suffering can serve as, quote, an experience that helps a person to cultivate virtue, which directs a person to achieve happiness. The instrumentality of pain paves a way to discover the value of human life. And they further conclude by saying, quote, when the patient could recognize the instrumental value of suffering, one may gain a sense of right autonomous control over one's experience, such that he or she can accept suffering as a friend or tame it as a pet rather than wasting one's energy in fighting it as an enemy or escaping it as a predator. I consider this the weakest argument because it doesn't apply to those at the end of their life. To accept it, you need to believe in God, an afterlife, or some sort of spiritual framework. That said, while it's the weakest argument in this context, I do think there are situations where suffering can be beneficial. Let me explain. Suffering, or convincing yourself that suffering has value, can be helpful if it's temporary and life eventually returns to a baseline level of quality. For example, imagine being a Jewish person in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. Believing that pain has purpose or that suffering can help you discover meaning might give you a better chance at surviving and give you the strength to endure and fight whatever comes at you. A meaningful narrative can be a powerful tool to help someone persevere through unimaginable hardship. For end-of-life patients, however, there's no other side. There's no miracle waiting to restore their health. Their tumors continue to grow, their organs continue to fail, and their quality of life continues to decline. In these cases, suffering serves no purpose because they won't live to reap its supposed benefits. Unless you believe in an afterlife, this argument falls apart for terminal patients, making it the weakest one in this debate. You've probably heard before about someone being told they only had a few months to live, deciding, "F it, I'm just going to fight this goddamn disease," and ultimately surviving. This leads to the argument, what if a doctor gives an inaccurate prognosis and that pushes a patient to choose MAID when they might have survived? While this concern might seem valid, it's not a particularly strong argument. That's because people don't usually choose MAID solely based on their prognosis. A 2018 study asked patients who are about to undergo MAID about their reasons for requesting the procedure. 59.8% cited disease-related symptoms, 52.7% mentioned loss of autonomy, and 49.1% pointed to a loss of ability to enjoy activities. These findings suggest that quality of life, not just the knowledge of their illness, is the driving factor behind their decision. Of course, patients should get all the information available about potential treatments, but the information that they're given should be realistic. Here are the treatments, here's the percentage of people who get better after getting the treatment, it might lengthen your life by X amount of months, but also here are the side effects. And if you don't want to go through those side effects, there's palliative care and MAID available. In her book, This is Assisted Dying, Stephanie Green explains that some patients seek a MAID consultation upon diagnosis to gather information and understand how the process works. However, this doesn't accelerate their desire to die. She notes that many of her patients end up enduring far more pain than they initially believed they could. Quote, "By then I had observed that my patients tended to know when their time had come, when their suffering had become too much. I always encourage those in my care to trust their instincts. In the end, many decided to live well past the conditions they thought would be intolerable, discovering that not being able to get in and out of bed isn't always as terrible as expected. Perhaps some folks delayed for the sake of their loved ones, but mostly I believe they did this because they found inner strength and resources they didn't know they possessed, a deep desire to live as long as they could possibly bear it, and yes, at times a bit of hope." This testimony shows that people don't just jump the gun on MAID, they often wait until their suffering is truly unbearable before making the decision. If someone wants to fight their illness until the very end, they can, and some might succeed. But for those who don't want to continue, they should be given all the information and the choice to proceed. Take ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, as an example. Patients with ALS are typically given a prognosis of 3 to 5 years, during which they will inevitably lose the ability to walk, talk, eat, swallow, and eventually to breathe. This decline isn't a question of if, but when. For individuals facing this reality, the ability to plan their final years, especially their preferences for the period when they lose basic functions, is crucial. Given that no cure is currently available, expecting a miraculous recovery isn't realistic. In such cases, a planned death is, I would argue, far more preferable to suffocation at an unknown date and time. This way, individuals can pass away surrounded by their loved ones. And studies have shown that deaths by euthanasia results in less traumatic grief for family and friends. For those who oppose MAID, I really recommend reading the book This is Assisted Dying, because the author offers a detailed exploration of the often overlooked beauty of passing away with your loved ones present. And in the end, if your concern is that people might survive otherwise, it's important to note that individuals already have the option to stop additional treatments. You could argue that some who stop their treatments might have lived, but ultimately, as long as they're properly informed, it's their choice to make. If doctors are allowed to kill you, then we can't trust them anymore because they might kill us when we're down. I think this argument often stems from a low opinion of doctors. Perhaps some people have had negative experiences or simply harbor a general distrust in medicine. It's true that, like any other humans, doctors can become desensitized to patient suffering, especially when they are under significant stress. However, I do believe most doctors care deeply about their patients and aim to provide the best possible care. The only substantial evidence I've seen suggesting that doctors have used coercive language comes from the state of Oregon in the United States. Handin and Foley found that safeguards were sometimes bypassed, including failing to discuss other end-of-life alternatives, using coercive language, and conducting psychiatric evaluations to protect clinicians rather than patients. Outside of this, there doesn't seem to be any significant evidence from countries with universal healthcare that doctors are exploiting vulnerable people when it comes to MAID. As for the elderly people carrying anti-euthanasia cards in the Netherlands, while I'm not fully aware of the specifics, I believe this could stem from a misunderstanding of the end-of-life procedures. One source that might be contributing to this fear is the Ramlink report. In the 1990s, the report indicated that more than 50% of euthanasia cases occurred without the patient's explicit consent, or sometimes even without their knowledge. At first glance, this sounds concerning, but the follow-up study, the Ramlink study 2 years later, clarifies the context. It explains that these cases generally involve patients who are near death and suffering terribly. It says, quote, "In 2/3 of cases, opioids or sedatives had been used. The decision to hasten death was nearly always taken after consultation with the family, nurses, or one or more colleagues. In all situations in which there had been no discussion with the patient and in which no wish of the patient was known, the patients were incompetent." The physicians were not randomly killing their patients. What they were doing is part of standard palliative care that is done across the world. It's called palliative sedation, where doctors administer sedative drugs to patients in extreme pain, causing them to fall into a coma until they pass away. And sometimes food and water are withheld to prevent excessive secretions that could worsen symptoms. The patient not being fed or hydrated will obviously die within a few days. But keep in mind that this is a last resort practice. Looking back at the graph from the Ramlink report, it appears that the 4,941 deaths caused by lethal morphine overdoses were likely instances of palliative sedation. That being said, it's crucial that patients' wishes are respected. Knowing whether a patient wants to be resuscitated or whether they want to be kept alive should be a fundamental part of end-of-life care. To ensure this, it's essential to encourage patients to communicate their wishes to their loved ones. And fortunately, in Canada, more elderly people are beginning to feel comfortable discussing these topics. In 2019, only 36% of Canadians had talked to their families about their care wishes, but by 2021, that number had risen to 59%. So, to conclude this rebuttal, the elderly people carrying anti-euthanasia cards in the Netherlands may actually be doing something beneficial. Their actions could help spark changes in how their healthcare system ensures a patient's wishes are respected. Alternatively, there may be a need for more information and clarification about the typical procedures doctors follow at the end of life. I think most of the time, this argument relies on theology to make its point, but here's how it was framed in a paper called Non-Faith-Based Arguments Against Euthanasia, Quote, human beings, then, are always and essentially a part of a community of persons, and as such, because of this connection with others as part of humanity, when another person kills him or herself or allows him or herself to be killed, life for every other human being is cheapened, devalued. Such an action says to some degree that life is not worth it, and although the effect on others may be seemingly minuscule, the more it happens, the greater the effects on others, like compounding interest on money. To me, this argument only holds if someone is killing themselves without any valid reason. If we accept suicide simply because someone feels like it, then I would agree that it devalues life. But if someone requests MAID because their quality of life is so poor that they no longer want to live, then how does that devalue life for those who are not in that situation? And for those individuals facing such conditions, I would argue that their lives are already being devalued by the illness itself. Medicine has come such a long way that we are able to manage all types of pain so that patients are not suffering at the end of their lives. So why should we offer MAID when these remedies are available and MAID could have unexpected consequences? Well, this argument has two main flaws. The first flaw is that, as we've seen earlier, the main reason why people want to have MAID is not because of pain, but because of a loss of autonomy and quality of life. It's a loss of being able to do what they like to do in life. Here's a quote from the book This is Assisted Dying. Quote, I was finding that pain was rarely cited by patients as the reason they were requesting an assisted death. Significant reduction in quality of life or an inability to do anything that brought joy or meaning to their lives were the reasons I heard most often, and international evidence told a similar story. The second flaw is that even though you can numb any pain with the right amount of opioids, those drugs have big side effects that could make taking them such a bad experience. I read a paper called, In Their Own Words, 7 Advanced Cancer Patients Describe Their Experiences with Pain and Their Use of Opioid Drugs. And in the paper, a patient named Archie explains that taking opioids made him feel zonked out and like he was losing his mind. Another patient named Connie said about opioids, quote, I don't know how to handle it. On the one hand, I have less pain with more medicine. On the other hand, I'm not quite there, and I guess I prefer to be quite there. But to be fair, some have completely different experiences with opioids depending on the type and amount of pain they have. One patient said, quote, once the pain was relieved, it was the most beautiful experience of my life to be able to participate and control the pain. So it's not just as simple as saying that all pain can be alleviated. For some, alleviating the pain makes them want to live longer. For others, their pain is so great that opioids just takes away even more of their quality of life by numbing not only their pain but also their mind. So at the end of the day, as long as the patient gets all the information available, they should be able to make their own decision and figure out what works best for them. We allow medical assistance in dying, there will be abuses, and the eligibility criteria will keep expanding. More and more people will choose MAID over receiving proper palliative care. This argument is one of the strongest against MAID because it's a legitimate concern we must remain vigilant about. It's something that we should always be cautious of. We obviously don't want vulnerable individuals being coerced into an irreversible procedure. And for that reason, the data surrounding MAID and similar procedures should be transparent to spot potential slippery slopes. But is there any evidence that such a slippery slope is actually occurring in countries where MAID is legal? Well, not really. What often gets cited is the increasing number of people opting for MAID instead of a natural death. This is something that we should expect. For instance, when physicians began providing MAID in Canada in 2016, people weren't familiar with the procedure, they didn't know how to navigate it, they didn't realize it was legal, and it still carried a bit of a taboo. But as the public became more informed, those nearing the end of their lives felt more comfortable seeking consultations. So, as long as the appropriate safeguards are in place, an increase in the number of people receiving MAID shouldn't be viewed as an issue. As for the broadening of eligibility criteria, this is something we should expect when making a procedure like MAID legal. At the start, the guidelines might be too strict, too vague, or exclude certain conditions. But as the procedure is used more gray area cases will arise and we'll have to adjust the definitions. You can think of, defining unbearable pain like defining what a table is. You might begin with a simple definition. A table is a slab with 4 legs. But then someone might ask, what about slabs with 3 legs? Or couldn't a chair also be a slab with 4 legs? Defining things is really complicated, and it's clear we won't have the perfect definition right from the beginning. So, as long as there are reasonable discussions and debates being done on this issue, we shouldn't worry too much about the broadening of eligibility criteria. Additionally, in a literature review on MAID, the author stated, quote, there was no overall evidence of heightened risk of death among vulnerable groups. On the contrary, when we look at the statistics from Oregon, 96% of those receiving physician-assisted suicide were white and well-educated. For me, slippery slope arguments sound convincing at first, but as I think more deeply about them, they kinda lose their power. What we as a society deem right or wrong will evolve over time. I could say that allowing people with mental disorders to access MAID is wrong today, but in the future, as we learn more about mental health, it could become a more accepted practice. Take for example a slippery slope argument made in 1895 against women's right to vote. It was said that if women were granted the right to vote, marriages would look like this in 2001. This might have been seen as a bad thing in 1895, but today, who cares? If you want your wedding to look like this, you're free to do so and nobody will bat an eye. Sentiment changes, we gather more and more information, and just because something was considered wrong or right in the past doesn't mean it will be viewed that way in the future. Now returning to MAID, as long as we collect data to ensure there's no funny business going on, I don't think we should fear a slippery slope. For example, if we notice that a high percentage of people are citing loneliness as one of the reasons for choosing MAID, we can use that information to course correct. And it looks like Canada is already on the right track. In 2021, Canada revised the MAID law to improve data collection and reporting. This revision aimed at gathering data starting from the very first requests for MAID and ensuring there was no individual or systemic inequality in how it's delivered. And if as a society we collectively feel, okay, MAID has gone too far, we can always protest. But so far, no country that has legalized euthanasia has moved to repeal the legislation. Caring for a patient is expensive, and in a country with a universal healthcare system, the government might decide that to cut costs, they could deny you care and pressure you into choosing MAID. They could leave you suffering so that your only option becomes euthanasia. I think this is the most compelling argument against MAID, especially if you're not familiar with it. It was the one that made me think the longest. So, should we be worried about the government trying to kill us to save money? Well, we should certainly be concerned about cutting costs, but whether MAID is legal or not, it won't make a difference. This is because compared to palliative care, MAID isn't significantly cheaper, and according to the paper I referenced earlier, these savings are, quote, unlikely to be substantial at the institutional or national level. And this might sound counterintuitive. Why would keeping someone alive be cheaper than euthanizing them? I couldn't find more detailed information on this, but it's probably for a similar reason that giving capital punishment to someone is more expensive than keeping them in prison for life. So, the safeguards in place are probably what makes MAID just as expensive as keeping someone in bed and providing them with pain medication. Now, what about denying life-saving surgery like in the case of Alison Ducluso? Well, unfortunately, in a universal healthcare system, there will always be decisions about what treatments the government approves and which one it denies. It's not like in private healthcare systems like the US where you can just pay for whatever you want regardless of the success rate. In a universal system, it's taxpayers who foot the bill for treatments. And as a taxpayer, I want my taxes spent on patients who are most likely to survive. I don't want my taxes to go toward an expensive treatment with only a 2% chance of success. And in Ducluso's case, her surgeon thought the surgery had a 50% chance not to cure, but to only slow down the condition, and that she had anywhere from 2 months to 2 years to live. Then the surgeon told her to get her affairs in order and to decide if she wanted MAID. Now, how should we analyze this situation? Well, since the topic of this video is euthanasia, we should ask, did the fact that MAID was legal change how she was treated? And it doesn't seem to have made a difference. If euthanasia wasn't legal, she would have been recommended palliative care instead, and the surgeon would have said the same thing. Get your affairs in order and decide if you want to die at home or in a palliative care hospice. That doesn't mean the Canadian healthcare system doesn't have its own flaws. Wait times are long, and seeing a specialist can take weeks and sometimes months. We should push for a better system, but MAID doesn't affect whether or not we achieve that. Furthermore, if we believe that democracy works, we should expect increasing investments in healthcare since the population is aging. I, as a 23-year-old man, don't think too much about the care I'll need when I'm 80 while I'm voting. But 60-year-old voters do, and that part of the population is growing larger. So unless demographic trends shift drastically, I don't think we'll start euthanizing elderly people for fun. Now, what about providing MAID for those who only have a mental disorder and aren't about to die? Well, in Europe, some countries like the Netherlands already offer this procedure to individuals with severe mental illnesses who've tried everything else. But in Canada, we won't get the findings from the Joint Committee investigating this question until 2027 or later. However, whether or not it should be allowed is outside the scope of this video. So if this video gets enough like, I'll make an entire video dedicated to MAID for mental disorders, or MAID MD SUMC, medical assistance in dying for patients whose only underlying medical condition is a mental disorder. Thank you for watching, and if you disagree with anything that I said, be sure to join my Discord server so we can discuss it. Bye bye.